Thank you for coming. My name is Geneviève Zobrzitsky. I'm director of the Center for European Studies, CES, and I'm the William H. Sewell Jr. Collegiate Professor of Sociology. I'm delighted to host you this afternoon for this CES lecture. It's a series that's called Conversations on Europe, and we're delighted to have Randall Hall with us to speak about seeing European developmentalism, the transition from colonial rule to foreign aid across European media. I'd like to thank also the German department for co-sponsoring the event, and also for the many students. It's very exciting to have so many students showing up to some of our events, because often it tends to be faculty, friends of the speakers, friends of the organizers, and students. Somehow we do this for you guys, and they're not here, so really excited to see you. Randall Hall is the Klaus W. Jonas Professor of German Film and Cultural Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He directs the European Studies Center, the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence at Pitt, as well as the Critical European Culture Studies PhD program. He is extremely well published, as you must know. He has written in journals such as the International Journal of Cultural Policy, New German Critique, and he's the author, among many others, of German Film After Germany, Toward a Transnational Aesthetic, published in 2008 with University of Illinois Press. The Europeanization of Cinema, Interzones and Imaginative Communities, also with University of Illinois Press in 2014. And Visual Alterity, Seeing Difference in Cinema, recently, 2021, a COVID baby.
Oh, yes, exactly. And also with Illinois Press.
Also, so you're a very faithful author.
They're faithful.
Yeah,
They're good.
very good. They should reward your faithfulness for your next book. His research is focused now on Europe's moving images, and I think that the lecture today is part of this. And I'd like also to invite you to future events of CES, so I will just say a few words. There's one in 2 weeks, March 14th. That's Copernicus Center for Polish Studies and CES, What's in a Name? A Lot, From Gypsy to Rom, the Roma in Polish Discourse on Minorities. A Conversations on Europe, also on March 18th, with visiting Professor Sabina Loriga from l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She's visiting for 8 weeks in the Department of History, and she will be speaking on strategies for de-demonizing fascism. The lecture will be in this room. And then on April 8th, another Conversations on Europe with Professor Kristen Surak, who's Associate Professor of Political Sociology at London School of Economics. She'll be speaking about her new book, Can the EU Shut Down the Sale of Citizenship? Unpacking the Geopolitics of the Global Market and Golden Passports. So 3 CES lectures this semester still. And I want to invite everyone also to visit the exhibit next door that's called Opening Today. Camera as Passport, Photography Exhibit, Camera as Passport, period. A photography exhibit. So it's actually an exhibit of photographs taken by Jewish refugees from Europe, then on the Winnipeg, the boat that took them to the US, and in the US it's curated by Professor of History Deborah Dashmore and Louis Kaplan. So I invite you to see this, and there's also a lecture, or the opening lecture, that's going to be March 11th. And so now I leave the floor to our distinguished guest, Randall Hall.
Okay. I have way too much material, so I'm going to start my timer at 45 minutes. Geneviève and Gosia said you have 40 minutes, 45. I'm going to stretch it to 45. When that's over, that's when we're over, and then you can ask me all sorts of questions, hopefully. That'll be interesting. But let me begin first by thanking Geneviève, Gosia, and Kristen for the invitation, for the welcome, for patience with me. They were trying to extract dates and settle everything, and I was resistant to, I'm too busy, sort of, but it was a very stressful last couple of months, and so I do appreciate very much your patience. And I really am delighted that you're all here. This is indeed a talk, so I'll be going through this, speaking to you. I have a very large manuscript that keeps growing, just like the archive that I'll talk about in a minute. But it is a talk from my current research, and what it'll look like is I'm going to talk to you first about the European Visual Archive that I'm working with, and then we'll discuss a little bit, or I'll discuss with you a little bit, the structure of newsreels, something that we think we know a lot about, but maybe we don't exactly know all that much about. And then I'm going to turn to this question of Eurafrica, the period in the immediate post-war, post-World War II era that is often described as the second colonial occupation, so a kind of reassertion of a golden age of colonialism. And potentially from then to look at media more closely that is charting out what I would be describing as the shift from a colonial to a developmental gaze. And then, if we have time, there would be a coda to talk about the current situation of German and Namibian relations as an example of what's happening in the present. So this is a little bit in the earlier period, but it has an arch that goes all the way up to the present. The visual archive that I'm working with, and indeed, as Geneviève said, this is coming out of a large project that's right now called Europe's Moving Images. And there's very little research, almost none in English. Most of it is done by colleagues from within the German context, and most of that research that has been done about the kind of construction of an image of Europe comes from a very West European and EU-centered narrative. So I've been trying to think a little bit more complicatedly. If that's not complicated enough, I've been trying to think a little bit more complicatedly about it. And Geneviève already identified some of the books that I've authored. And one of the things I'm interested in is this idea here of how Europe, in relationship to the imagined community of the nation state, is producing imaginative communities that are in opposition or in context or in relationship to the nation state. But as I was thinking about how this project, the research which has been done has been centered on Western Europe, I was thinking, well, there's an image of Europe that is also an Eastern European image of Europe in the Cold War. And then beyond that, we can say that there's even something that one might describe as a third image of Europe, and that is from the colonized world. There are only 5 countries that were not colonized by European powers, and so this impact of Europe, and precisely looking at the period that we often describe as the era of decolonization, there is an image of Europe. And to preempt some of that, one of the things that is clear is that that image is itself controlled by Europe. Newsreel production is a Hollywood and European-based production. It is the primary means of producing images of Europe, and there are no images, newsreels being produced by the decolonizing world until Tito, in alignment with the non-aligned movement, starts sending newsreel kinoks out into the decolonizing world. So Mali, Kenya, Tanzania, all of Algeria's visual projects of the period of decolonization come out of that relationship to Yugoslavia. So there's an interesting dynamic there as a kind of third player in this. And I'm trying to figure this out using some of the work that comes from my earlier projects to put it all in context. But it's turning into this kind of strange and enormous archive of material. And if any of you are interested in looking at this, I'm more than happy to share with you the list I have here, the various archives. Many things are online. If you can go to Florence, to the Historical Archive of the European Union, please do. It's the most lovely place to do any kind of research. You need to figure out how to do a project there, just because it's so beautiful, but also because it's just a rich resource of things that are really present. But online, for instance, the European Commission alone has 500,000 moving image items, all of them free for download, for use, in anything that you want. You have to credit them, but it's there available for you. That's 500,000 items alone that are available to us, thinking about the image of Europe. So part of what I'm trying to do is indeed come up with certain themes that help me run threads through this. And this project on what we might describe as Eurafrica, on developmentalism, is one of the central threads in one of the chapters right now. There are others, but what I thought I would do is I would play this for you, because what I've also been doing is acquiring editing skills and trying to create short little films in association with each of the chapters. I'm not great at this yet. Probably undergrads in the room are much better at it than I am. But this gives you some sense from a different thread, just a couple of minutes of that, of how I'm working and how I'm thinking here. So let's see if we can watch this for a moment. The work of the moving image in the post-war European project begins as the German troops are withdrawing from occupied territories. To motivate spectators and provide the basis for a new post-fascist order, the resistance in France started to produce newsreels already in 1944. With the liberation of the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on in the West, but also throughout Eastern Europe, newsreel production begins, everywhere, with the same iconography. Common across the newsreels in Europe are images of last battles, destroyed buildings, displaced persons, hunger, confusion, but also liberation, cleanup, and rebuilding, trials, leaders and youth, hopeful images asking, what next? We recognize easily the emergence of a Europe in image as an answer to this question. Scenes of political reorganization, congresses of European civilian leaders, gatherings of people aiming for a unified Europe are accompanied by images of peace treaties and other documents, along with maps and charts. Production of what we can call the Europe film does not remain with the newsreel companies. The Marshall Plan alone generated 300 Europe films from the year 1949 to 1955. This massive undertaking was matched in the East by the Comecon and the Common Forum. And likewise, the development of new European institutions, Council of Europe, the Western European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Communities, along with newly founded parties and organizations, produced an archive of newsreels and short films relatively unknown today. The work of the moving image... No, not anymore. You already heard him. So you see that these are about short films, these are about newsreels, these are about items that are actually rarely more than 20 minutes long, very few feature films. It's also a new terrain for me to be investigating. So I'm very excited about it. As I said, one of the threads here is this question of Eurafrica. And this is a term that is not my term, it is actually a fairly old term, well preceding the post-war period, going back into long periods of thinking about a relationship between Europe and Africa, that at particular stages we're also thinking about the relationship of the United States to Latin America, and so a kind of contiguous north-south under global hegemony of the North. And so this kind of claim to be in control of a space. And what's interesting here, and I'll return to this, is that it is often not known that this was at the heart, this Eurafrican project was at the heart of the post-war European project and its reconstitution. That's something that I want to return to in a little bit. But what I think at heart that I'm also trying to explore with you and in this chapter in particular is the way that, in effect, there was a debate that started in the 60s about the transition from what one might describe as slavery into industrial capitalism, in which there was an argument that was presented by economic historians that slavery was actually more expensive than wage labor, because don't misunderstand me, but the idea is that having to care for people's bodies and house them and clothe them versus simply being able to employ and fire them requires more investment of energy, more investment of resources to tend to that. And one might say that there's something that similarly happened in the period of decolonization, that the shift from colonial direct state control over territories to a kind of developmental relationship actually winds up being a certain kind of economically cheaper way of keeping control over vast territories of the globe without having to have, in effect, a full military presence or settlers in the space. So, right. And as I said, that's an argument of economic historians, which I am not. I am a visual culture scholar, and that is something that I think is important for us back to this question of imagined versus imaginative communities. Because one of the things that I'm trying to consider here and with you is how, in effect, our own imaginative world is constructed if our relationships are very deep, embedded, and complex connectivities. Why is it that we do not understand ourselves as also in deep solidarity with the people with whom we're very much in contact? Right? And part of that is the way that we produce our images, and we can look at our images to think about them as representing back to ourselves how we perceive the world. And at this period, it really is a moment in which the newsreel is playing a very, very formative role. And there's a couple things about the newsreel that I want to clarify with you before we look at the content itself. But what is interesting for us to consider, one, is that the newsreel is not actually a medium of news. The newsreel is a medium of entertainment. News at this point in time is largely something that if one is looking for the actual quotidian news, one looks at the newspaper, one listens to the radio. The newsreel is something that's playing in the cinemas, and it is part of an entertainment industry. No one needs to go see it, but it's part of an entire structure of appealing to an audience and presenting them, therefore, a vision of the world. The post-war period is a period in which the newsreel actually arises to what one might describe as its golden age. We often think, precisely because of the experience in, say, the Third Reich, that the newsreel is a vehicle for propaganda. But we could say that it's, in that level, something that's operating within its own system of production, producing its own kinds of images in their own logic. That might mean for us to go back to what I was saying before in thinking here that if we're representing the colonized world, that image of the colonized world is not being produced in the colonized world by the colonized peoples, but rather is creating a kind of vision for the colonizer of what that world looks like. We might describe that as propaganda, we might describe it as ideology, we could describe it as entertaining the colonizers. The further thing that's interesting for us to consider is that in the immediate post-war era, there's a shortage of footage. AGFA has been destroyed, which was one of the major producers of film material. And the major producer at this point in time is in Rochester, New York, Kodak, Eastman Kodak. And in effect, they have largely a monopoly over footage. this creates a situation in which it's not only a matter of scarcity, but the price goes up. So newsreels become something that is an important commodity. And the newsreel agencies start to collaborate with each other, creating what's described as a rota system, a rotational system. So it is then a kind of collaboration and cooperation across the various companies to say, okay, we have 3 people from various companies stationed in London. There's an event with the Queen coming up, and who's going to go film it? And then you share the footage. And so there's a certain kind of standardization. Each of the newsreel companies can edit these things in a different fashion, accept it or not. It's much the origin of a certain kind of newswire structure that the media share today. If you read across various newspapers, you'll see sort of sharing of images. So it's very much like that, and it was a cost-sharing mechanism. So we see a kind of standardization of storytelling across all of these. And sorry, wait a second. I have all this information here that I want to make sure so we have this kind of standardization of the visual language that's taking place to create a kind of reality, to create a sense of liveness in this medium. It may be surprising then to see that one of the first items of newsreel footage in the French context in 1945 is a report on an event, an exposition that takes place in the Grand Palais in Paris. And I'm going to show you this footage with the understanding that here we have an example then of how a newsreel is being used in order to frame the understanding of the colonies. And this is something, again, that I want to underscore. In a moment of scarcity, it should lead us to actually investigate for a second why it is that by October 1945, the French government is already presenting an exposition on the participation of the colonies in the war and why this is being promoted and how it's being promoted. And so let's just look at this for a little bit. It is in French, and I can talk you a little bit through what's going on here.
Le 18 juin 1940, c'était à l'Empire tout entier que le général de Gaulle lançait son appel. Et l'Empire répondait. La France libre voyait se rallier à elle, les uns après les autres, tous ceux de ses fils qui refusaient la défaite, continuer la guerre et préparer la victoire. Le premier exemple était donné au Tchad par le gouverneur général.
Oops. That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry.
L'exposition du Grand Palais à l'Empire tout entier.
So one of the things that I want to underscore for you is that in the exposition, you can see that it's an exposition that's being presented with largely only white people, only white French presence. In effect, it's being presented as a celebration of the contributions of the colonial forces, and yet they are not present. In fact, actually, what is present is rather exotic, anthropological, ethnographic kinds of objects, or signs of how their resources are being used to contribute. Then we see the forces, the colonial forces, but here one of the things that's interesting for us is to also recognize the way that they're being framed. There continues to be a certain kind of exoticism involved. control over technology remains largely in the hands of white forces here. The colonized, the colonial forces are participating in the endeavor. This sequence, however, starts to frame something that we might describe as a developmental gaze. It starts to look forward. And there's a number of things that are happening here in which we see black people taking care of black people's bodies. We see certain signs of modernity, but yet in a scene like that, we also see this kinds of clash of the modern with what we might describe as a primitive. Nevertheless, the entire relationship here of presentation is one of resources, natural resources, human resources that are there for the service of the Republic, the service of the country.
Elle cultive le riz de ses enfants. Telle est la France d'outre-mer dont les hommes se sont levés pour notre...
So, there's a number of things to be said about this. I have a clip, I'm going to not show it right now, from a similar project from the Netherlands from exactly the same month. And the Dutch, if the French have the resources being supported by the Americans, the Dutch have even fewer resources. So the fact that actually in October of 1945, the same month, there's a newsreel item from what is then called Batavia, Indonesia, when the Dutch aren't even yet fully in charge of the region, it tells us something about the anxiety or the concern of the colonies. And I want to remind you that in 1945, in May, precisely on the same day of the celebration of European victory, the French engage in the first massacre in Algeria that will ignite the Algerian War of Independence. By September of that year, so just a few months before this exposition is staged, the Indochina War has already broken out in a kind of long simmering development, and it boils up and becomes increasingly intense. And so we see that this is a moment in which for France, for the Netherlands, the concern and the presentation of the image that we're seeing is set against a backdrop of the loss of the colonies moving out of the colonizers' control. And this is not at all what we're seeing in the images. We're seeing quite a different kind of presentation of that relationship here. So we have then this period as a period then that we would describe as the beginning of decolonization, but a period which is nevertheless not being presented to the newsreel audience as such. So I know that there's a number of, I'm going to move us now to look at how this intersects with the European project. And I know that there's a number of people here from the sort of German background and German training. And one of the things that I'm also discussing in the larger project here is certain kinds of fallacies about German colonialism, the brevity fallacy, the amnesia fallacy, and I can talk more about what I mean by that if you're interested. But one of the things that I'm really interested in underscoring for you here is the caesura fallacy. That is to say that even Jürgen Zimmerer suggests that with the end of World War II, German colonial history is over. All right? And Jürgen Zimmerer is one of the preeminent theorists and critics, historians of the colonial undertaking. What I'm trying to underscore for us here is that actually it's not over. And in fact, aside from the 12 years of the Weimar Republic, colonial enterprise is a consistent and continuous project within Germany. That if we think of colonialism in only one form, we neglect to understand that colonialism has various kinds of typologies. There are various forms. Settler colonialism, state-controlled colonialism is not the only form. And Germany has always been part of the colonial project. German settlers have always been traveling along with other colonial forces. But we can think of World War II as itself a colonial enterprise, largely focused on Eastern Europe, largely focused on the Polish territories. But we can also think about the way that the North African expedition is itself a part of supporting the Italian colonial project. And so there's a kind of integrated understanding there. But it is also then the case that in the immediate post-war period, the colonial project re-emerges. And it re-emerges precisely in the move here as the colonies themselves start to seek independence. And many of the colonies are seeking independence precisely because of the contribution that they made to World War II, and many of the promises that were made to them that if they contributed to the war effort, they would receive increased autonomy and a certain kind of home rule. But that's not being lived up to, as it were, on the part especially of the French, but also the Belgian. And the Dutch initially are trying to reassert their control. But they quickly have to give up because it's just too far. They have very few resources. So what we see then is as the move after the success of the European coal and steel community, the move towards the creation of the European communities, the European Economic Community, Euratom, and a number of other projects that were aspired to but never actually took place, a kind of legislative European political body and a European defense force. As we're moving towards the development of the European Economic Community, the French introduce into the discussion a request to bring the overseas territories, the overseas colonies and territories into the new developing European Economic Community. And at first, this is something that is met with a bit of skepticism on the other side of the Rhine. The German engagement with this concept is of concern not about the continuation of the colonial project, but the primary concern is that the French are going to use German resources in order to pay to bolster their control over their colonies. And so what becomes interesting here is that the German considerations are not against it, but to make sure that there's a regulation such that there's an equity of resources that are going to be extracted from the colonies that will be distributed throughout the European Six at the time. We can see in this process that this is something that's highly debated in the German press, as well as in the French, the Belgian, the Italian, the Dutch, and the Luxembourg press, the initial European community partners. Not something that is without its own reproduction of exotic and racist images, but fully participating in the discussion of what is the relationship that we will be having to the colonies. Right? So there's a willingness to participate in that. And Heinrich Brentano, here in this letter from 1956, has been participating. He's the foreign minister, and he's been participating in the conversations and assures Adenauer that we can move forward on this project because in the negotiations we've actually agreed to an economic situation. And I can explain what that economic situation might look like, but we've agreed to an economic situation that will be to our benefit as well, and that will not drain our resources. And let's just understand that this is really a kind of shift that is also part of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that is taking place in Germany, but also in Italy. It's itself an outgrowth of the success of the Marshall Funds, and an assertion then via this new economic power, new economic stability, a new kind of control over the colonies. So you can see on that map on the my far left, we would probably say far right there, the map of the entire holdings. And I really want to underscore that, again, about our ideational world. One of the things about that map is that, and actually I have a better map later on that will come back to this point, but this is not the imagining of the European Economic Community that most of us have in our heads when we think about the map of the EEC. So if we look at the Treaty of Rome that constitutes the European Economic Community, we can recognize that Articles 131 through 136, Section 4 in effect, an entire section of the treaty, are devoted to a discussion of the association of the overseas colonies and territories. What that means in the annex is that these regions are under the economic control of the European Economic Community. And I want to underscore that there is never a moment where anybody from those regions is consulted in this process. This is a decision that is made over their heads, not by any means at eye level, not as an act of bringing people into an equal form of economic development or considerations. These are territories that are brought in order to, in effect, gain control. And to create a little bit of an arch into the present, one of the things that might be of interest to us to note is that this is not only a historical project, so that this does take place, but it transforms in various ways. And if any of you have a euro note, a 5 euro, a 10 euro note, you can actually see on the map of Europe, you will find the overseas territories included on the euro note. So it's actually something that the European Union produces. That map is a map pre-Brexit. I need to find a better one. It's 2013. So you can discount the Commonwealth and the British aspects of it at this point in time. But nevertheless, I mean, it shows you that even to this moment, that our map of Europe, our mental map of Europe, is a very different mental map if we move to a little bit of a higher global investigation of where control and where exchange is taking place. Right. So, let's see. Okay. We're not even to the moving image stuff yet. But again, one of the things that's of interest also in this project and this process that I would like to underscore with you is that there is this kind of seamlessness of a move from the Marshall Plan to the reassertion through the European Economic Community of a new kind of devotion of resources, by which I mean in the German context, for instance, the 1948 at the European level, what is now the OECD, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, at that point in time is constructed to distribute the Marshall Fund resources. So in conjunction with that, in 1949, in Germany, as in other countries throughout Europe, ministries are constructed within the government. New ministries are constructed in the government to. This is what is going on. There we go. New ministries are constructed in the government to.
Your computer.
Yeah, I was doing this before a couple times. I'm surprised it didn't. There we go.
There was when we pushed the laptop up there, it came back.
Is the cable well?
Yeah, it wasn't the cable. I did this to keep you awake. There was a scheme on my part. Now it's not doing that. That's right.
Are you sure that the cable there is like...
So, do you mind? As a film scholar, this is like the thing, right? You need to be prepared for just doing it. So let me try and be entertaining, but it might make it hard to show you some clips. So we have this interesting construction then in the process of the development of the European Economic Community, where ministries, where ministries are being formed in the various governments who become responsible first for distributing and managing the Marshall Fund wealth, support, and then seamlessly shift over into, in effect, replicating the kinds of development models out into the rest of the world. Right? And so one of the things that's interesting for us to note is that in 1949 the Bundesministerium für Angelegenheiten des Marshallplans becomes the Bundesministerium für Zusammenarbeit, and ultimately in 1993, in the moment of a kind of recognition, self-critical recognition, it becomes the Bundesministerium für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit und Entwicklung. And there's a whole debate about development versus development cooperation, development aid, that's being played out here in the names. But largely then this becomes the Ministry for Foreign, what we might describe as foreign aid. And as I was saying, this is something that's replicated everywhere. What's part of the point of this, though, is that if there is a new ministry in Germany that's being deployed in this fashion, the colonial forces that have historically been present are also being reformed and reshaped. So development and the development model that is emerging at this moment relies on the presence of the colonial schools, the colonial ministers, the bureaucracy, to seamlessly shift over from direct control to being the administering forces of aid. Right? And so there's a kind of vast apparatus, especially in Africa, but in many parts of the world, that is already present, that is now being reframed to participate in this economic project. Right? And we get back to the assertion that I made at the beginning, that this actually winds up being a kind of more cost-efficient way of maintaining control over these regions by bringing people into a kind of economic dependence. In the historical language, this is something that was described under the terms of uneven and unequal development. Right? So that the what now becomes constituted as the third world or the developing world is always kept in a situation of being developed at a rate and a standard that is beneficial primarily to the global north, to Europe, to the United States and its own involvement in the aid paradigm as well, while the industrialization of the South, of the global South, is largely investment in creating possibilities for the extraction of natural resources that then are processed and brought into the North for various purposes. Okay. What does this look like? How does this appear? So I have been trying to create some sort of catalog or categorization of these different scopic regimes, different ways of seeing, different ways of presenting. And there are ways in which there are overlaps. One of the things that is consistent across the colonial and the developmental gaze is the last, and you'll see this, I have another slide that discusses developmental gaze, but I want to draw attention to the understanding of expertise. And if the newsreel is a voice-over narrative structure, expertise at this point is always about, in effect, the ability of what we might describe as the global north to speak about, to speak over, not necessarily in any way to have to speak to, with, or listen to the people who are being, in effect, represented, who are being via the Scopic regime brought under control. There are a number of other categories here. Certainly one of the central properties and things that we might recognize are the civilizational mission. In the language, we have often in the footage, we'll have very specific local representations that represent Africa. Right? And so very much the production of a word like Africa is used here. So a kind of metonymic relationship in which Sudan, Somalia, Namibia, they all stand in for Africa, right? And there's not a distinction or differentiation. Exoticization is certainly of importance here. Let me show you then some footage from
con le nazioni che ci erano ostili. E restiamo in Africa.
This is Italian
Somalia.
footage.
Qui c'era da riconciliare una parte dell'Italia col senso di menomazione provato al risveglio di un'avventura. C'era da difendere il nostro lavoro coloniale, le nostre amicizie. Gli indigeni di Badoa festeggiano Brusasca, un altro dei suoi collaboratori, il presidente. Indicano che le più difficili mete del conflitto africano sono state raggiunte. Tra le bandiere italiane sventolano le
What's interesting, surprising, and even perverse at this particular moment is that
insegne della Kabila che vive sotto la nostra amministrazione fiduciaria. E Brusasca potrà dire, a nome del governo De Gasperi, che l'adempimento dei nostri obblighi,
France and England, but nevertheless they returned to Somalia as the administrators in Brusaccia is the last colonial
dimostrano la nostra
Italian
volontà di collaborare alla legittima evoluzione del popolo somalo verso la sua indipendenza.
You can see here that what is constituted is a space of distance and difference that we arrive at through
Il
travel.
tempo ha cancellato
The language of the newsreel is one of cut into the next episode, and that can mean we go from Berlin to a small village in England,
La presenza d'Italia, leale partecipe di una comunità di popoli,
But
si
when we
rivela
travel
dovunque.
in this kind of
Operai
colonial
italiani
gaze,
lavorano alla strada tra
we're
il
actually
Tanganica e
being
l'Uganda.
given something
L'italiano è il loro
to
direttore,
appear
Inghier
to
De
us as being very
L'italiano è il
distant.
geometra Scaramella,
So
braccio destro.
in a period in which
Ritratti
newsreel
di
footage
luoghi,
is still
di
a
imprese,
commodity,
di uomini
to
che
actually
domani
devote
preciseranno
even
il
5
senso di
seconds,
un'epoca.
10 seconds to showing a plane, a
A 100
train, or
miglia
a
da
car
Nairobi,
driving
un
is
paradiso
to show us
terrestre
that it's
all'ombra di
distant.
migliaia di piante
And some of
di
the
caffè.
roads that are being
E la
presented
terra
here as
di minieri,
primitive.
dove i padri
One
della
might say if
Consolata
you
di
go
Torino
to
hanno portato il
southern
motto
Italy, you would
prega
find
e lavora.
very much the same kinds of
Qui
constructions.
lavorano tutti, dalle
So
suore
here
all'ultimo
there's a
frate,
kind of
per
primitivism that's
sollecitare e
being constructed.
guadagnarsi il
The
miracolo
other thing is
quotidiano della
if
provvidenza.
we've studied Karl May in any way, one of the things that's enchanting
A
is
queste
that there's
sorelle negre è stato
Italians
detto che
in
non il
civilized
colore della
form
pelle vale
everywhere,
davanti a Dio.
nuns here and resources there. But what we have
Ma il candore
are
dell'anima.
then again the control of technology in
Continuiamo la
the
rassegna.
hands
Essa
of the
dimostra che
Italians,
se Roma ha cessato di
the
voler comandare
development
con
and the
enfasi,
language
un'Italia ben
of
guidata sa
development
produrre
is an
altrettante
Italian
iniziative
force. But we see
nelle terre in qualche modo a lei legate,
natives
ponti, strade,
in
paese che vai,
staged
italiani che trovi.
positions in front of
Questi
the
operai
camera,
nostri stanno costruendo una serie
acting
di
in a way
400
that
chilometri
reproduces for the
che
camera a
diventerà
sense
la
of
più
primitivism.
importante del Tanganica. E 180 connazionali affidano a Brusasca il loro augurio a chi oggi conduce.
This is streaming off the web, so I'm going to, I think you get a sense of what's going on here. What's interesting in this sequence is when he actually arrives in Ethiopia. We have a very, very different representation, and suddenly Ethiopia is filled with dignitaries in Western suits. The meeting with Haile Selassie is one of Selassie is on a dais and is looking down on them, and there is a kind of protocol that takes place. A very, very different relationship than when we see him in Somalia at a distance with cheering crowds, held off at bay. The idea here is that he's the representative of democracy. The Italian representative of democratization is a little bit strange and perverse at this particular moment, but nevertheless, that's fine. But at a distance, right? 1957 is also the first anniversary of Ghanaian independence. I do not have this footage. I didn't bootleg it, unfortunately. I should have. But what we find here in this Wochenschau is a representation of Ghana and their celebration of independence that looks very much like this, with a British representative, Princess Anne, present first. We're seeing her, and we see primitive natives dancing about, and it ends with a segment of Kwame Nkrumah, whose name is mispronounced to Kwame Nkrumah, and he's dancing. So this incredible thinker of the decolonizing project and resistance is framed as just a jumping about, dancing native. So the developmental gaze, as I said, emerges in a way in which expertise is kept under the control of in effect, the European voice. But what we have then is the beginning of things that we might describe as individuation, an understanding of a certain kind of continentalism. So it is still Africa, but yet there are individuals who are operating. There are delegations from various places. So you might see a delegation from Benin, but then the language switches over into Africa. It is not necessarily a metonymic relationship in the same way, but it is in effect a kind of representation of a developmental mission in which those countries, those individuals who separate themselves in an orderly fashion from the colonial entities are praised. Revolution and violence is attributed to those countries which are not participating properly in the devolution of the colonial relationship. One of the things that winds up becoming important is the way that culture now comes to be represented. So what in effect previously was perhaps to be understood under the term primitivism is now being presented as a kind of cultural essentialism. But there is still this sense of a kind of subject who is educable, with whom we can speak and with whom we can participate in our projects. In this piece, for instance, we see, this is raw footage and then an interview with Hendrik Bruggeman, who is the rector of the Collège d'Europe, the College of Europe, and is himself a very significant European. And this is at the College of Europe in 1961, a constitution of a Euro-African Congress. And immediately one of the things that you can see is that this kind of level of individuation, educability, we have students in what we might describe as formal suits, perhaps to be described as Western dress, although I don't understand why that might be the property of the West per se to wear a nice suit. But we see then exactly this kind of presentation of individuals as participants in a learning process, and nevertheless, tone, that is to say, a voice is reserved in this project to be recorded of Bruggeman, who speaks about and was interviewed about the events that happened. And this would have been something that would have been available for distribution into a newsreel for production and individual editing. All right, that is 45 minutes. And I have so much more that I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about what exactly happens within the developmental paradigm, how, in effect, the Ministerium in Germany understands its mission. And I would love to talk to you about Namibia, but I promised 45 minutes, and that's it. So with that, I'm going to stop.
Handle the Q&A?
Sure. Yes. So do you have any questions? Is there anything that you'd like to have me follow up on?
We have about 20 minutes, so please.
I want to know what happens in Namibia. Do you have a short?
It's an interesting process. As the last government, that is to say, as the Merkel government is devolving, there's an agreement with Namibia, 2015. And some of you may have paid attention to this, but there's an agreement with Namibia that the German government is going to do a kind of Wiedergutmachung, a restitution, a reparation, paying a billion plus euros. The problem, however, becomes that there is no conversation with the Herero or Nama peoples. It is a conversation that takes place on a state-to-state basis. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the Herero and Nama people say, look, our descendants are impacted in a particular way and that you don't talk to us. And this is something that's actually being replicated throughout the reparation discussions throughout Africa, that the state level is in many ways seeking to control the resources and the discourse while ignoring the local population, because there are ways in which the developmental model has perhaps led to conditions of corruption, right? Or at least state interest in maintaining control over the resources. The UN gets involved, a special rapporteur. These people have a very important job these days to report on things, and they adjudicate that, yes, this is not the normal way that this should have transpired. It should have transpired in a different way. And so the Namibian government steps back and says, no, we're not going to agree, we're going to renegotiate this. Heiko Maas, who is then the Außenminister, the Minister of the Interior, says, no, we're not renegotiating. And you know what? We're giving you that development money. You're going to get this development money. All right, and we've earmarked it and it's going to go to you. What's interesting is that it's slated for all sorts of things that are largely about the fourth industrial revolution, green technology. And so it is about this kind of technological control, perpetuating an understanding that those people need technology, they don't have know-how, even though there's now at least decades and decades of interaction, education, fine university structures in Africa, engineers galore who could be consulted. But here the technology is in a particular flow, so it perpetuates this understanding of the poor them, who need the us to give them our things. So I could show you some documentation that shows, for instance, that the Handelskammer for Southwest Africa, which has 600 various members in it, produced then around this time a document for German small and medium enterprises. The SME is a standard of it's okay, we're at the end of it, so it's all right, we don't need any more images. Produces a document oriented towards German businesses saying the Namibian government is going to be producing calls for wind farms, solar energy, various kinds of resources. Their grid is in a devastated situation, and these are going to be open tender calls. Be prepared to submit to them. So in many ways, as the weapons industry, there's development aid industry does a certain thing of providing economic resources to a country that then is actually a kind of industrial aid to the homeland, as it were. And you repeatedly then see, instead of saying, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to bring resources in to build the grid and step back, something else happens. And the final thing that's interesting about this is that there was another outcry recently because the plans for green hydrogen, green liquid hydrogen, which is a very important thing that relies on solar energy, Namibia was identified as a source of green hydrogen. But the plans had no impact on the Namibian grid whatsoever in their initial formation. It was simply to create green hydrogen to be exported, to be inserted into the LNG terminals that are being built as part of the response to the Ukrainian gas crisis. And so you can see the kinds of logics that work here to perpetuate this kind of uneven and unequal distribution. The Saharan, there's a lot of interest in the Saharan solar projects, and also in their conception there is no impact on the local energy grid. There's arguments that it would overpower, that it would feed too much energy into those grids and blow them up. So updating a grid is expensive, but if you're actually interested in development and if you're actually interested in reparations, then, well, doesn't that seem what you should be doing? But it's not. So, there's much more about that. But, John.
Randall, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated actually getting to hear this sort of new presentation of it, because I've seen a sort of prior iteration of this before, and I liked
This is more or less coherent, I'm not sure. Anyway, yeah.
I think it's more.
Okay, good.
I have a question, sort of a larger conceptual question about your project, in terms of the framing of this sort of movement from a colonial gaze to a developmental gaze. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about this, because it seems to me that one could also frame this dichotomy as a continuity, right? That these are the underlying power structures, the underlying dynamics developing between Europe and the colonial world are not changing significantly, but they're being reframed in a way that is being adapted to fit the developing discourse in Europe about what Europe is and what Europe's involvement in the world means. And I'm sort of curious, because we see the presentation of your data and your framework, but not yet sort of where your project is going with this, if you could speak a little bit about how you see that change transpiring.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that I want to underscore. The initial understanding of Europe's moving images. One of the things that I did without plan is learn to speak German, Dutch, French, and understand Italian enough that I have access to the moving images of the first 6 countries. Spanish is, so as it expands, I'm not keeping up with everything. But what's intriguing to me is the way that there's a parity, a similarity of images, right? So the Italian foray into Somalia is repeated in images that I would describe as the colonial gaze, and in the German newsreel footage is repeated in the French newsreel footage. The representation of Africa in the Dutch newsreel, it's specific in its own national language, but the images are very homologous. Right, and I find that interesting, and that is not just for this project, but that kind of goes across the board here with what I'm describing as the European moving image. But here in particular, it becomes interesting because it's embedded in this relationship of control over a space and the construction first of an exotic and distancing and primitive language. And what we then see is the shift now to students. In the developmental gaze, we see a shift towards students who are largely learning from us, or learning from an us because we built schools, learning from us because we're showing them how to build a dam. But it's always this kind of we show them who are in need. There is a lot more that I have to do to work this out. Right? As I said at the beginning, I'm not an economic historian, and to be honest, what's intriguing to me is that critical studies of development and aid are not the dominant way of thinking about this. Undergrads, grad students, many of you may be thinking about Peace Corps. Many of you may be thinking about participating precisely in some of the aspects that are part of this entire project and understanding it as an incredibly valuable undertaking to go and dig and do and guide them in a project that helps them because I'm a noble person. So this isn't something that has been put under an extensive critical gaze, and I think there's work that both needs to be expanded, amplified in the actual economics. Most people write it off as Marxist critiques of capitalism, and fine, good. I'm all for that. But I think what's interesting as a visual scholar is precisely in a situation where we are looking at the Mediterranean being turned into a grave, that we are not recognizing our interdependence, right, across the Mediterranean. And it confuses me when I look at the complex connectivity that has been going on for centuries, that I'm asking myself, what is it that prevents, that forecloses an ideational relationship that doesn't see individuals on the other side of the Mediterranean as equals at eye level, bringing resources, but rather even as we have a refugee crisis, which is actually a drain on resources and a bringing of valuable individual potential into a space that is becoming underpopulated and needs people, right? But nevertheless, they're presented to us as refugees, they're presented to us as abject, impoverished, poor. Right? I think that's a question that intrigues me in this project. And I don't have it all worked out, but I do think one of the most powerful investigations in the contemporary moment of this is actually Agnieszka Holland's Green Border, which really begins by showing people coming from Syria, Afghanistan, etc., as doctors, people with resources, people with possibility, and then running up against an abjecting apparatus that destroys them, right? Out of for what purpose? And that's the language of development is what bothers me here. And I think one of the other things that's interesting for us is we're anxious about China, we're anxious about the Wagner Group, but the sense of an us as being noble in our helping of them actually betrays the fact that the vast majority of what we do is interrupt, create problems for, and prevent inner African trade. So African to African trade is inhibited by developmental aid with Europe, right? And the relationship to Africa is primarily a European relationship, right? With China being a central player, but the United States is not key there. So I didn't.
Yeah, I think
that took.
That's really helpful.
So yes, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I come from an overseas French department.
Which one?
La Réunion.
Ah, yeah. Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if you were planning to investigate those issues in the territories that were incorporated into the Republic, like today.
Yeah. So you can see that I focused on that. I mean, the energy up to this point in kind of parsing it out is precisely the inclusion of the overseas territories, but the actual impact of especially the French overseas territories, La Réunion, and the others is not something that I've actually yet investigated, and so I would be interested. Does this echo or rhyme with, and there are interesting relationships, in particular because the notion of francophonie, the monde francophone, these sorts of things promise a participation, but that participation has already been investigated by people like Frans Fanon extensively to question whether or not there is ever a possibility of a kind of equality here. But do you want to respond back to me with?
Oh, maybe we can talk later.
I would love that very
Think about
much.
it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you for remapping, the EU or the EEC. That's really enlightening. But I have, like the previous question, I have an expansionist.
Everybody wants more.
It's like,
No.
sort of, I'm wondering about the visual imaginary that competed with what you're portraying, namely the fact that after 45, there are these important creation of new states, India, Israel, Indonesia, and then, of course, Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and so on. Kind of it's a little bit later. And I just wonder what kind of, and the independent movements, which, when was the conference in Bandung, 1952 or something?
55.
55.
Yep.
And so it's, kind of at that moment that's exceedingly important. And I wonder whether there is a different visual imaginary that is being used or invoked or, that interacts with, sort of this rather defensive, kind of imaginary that you portray, but maybe it is just, a different version of the same thing, I just don't know. But at least when you think about the political imaginary at the time, it is a radically new departure for, kind of world politics at that moment, and people paid attention, so I'm just wondering about that.
Right.
And the second question is even more, complicated, I'm wondering about, sort of critical engagements with development in Africa, kind of that, sort of could shed light from a different perspective on your, kind of, your research as it develops.
So I said this at the beginning and would return to it, but what's interesting about the newsreel and the mediatization of the process that is very exciting. The creation of, in Bandung, 1955 is the first meeting of the Global South. It's a meeting of in Indonesia of, in effect, actually Asian and African communities speaking to each other and moving forward and thinking about the possibility of decolonization and what that might look like and creating resources for each other. But so at that moment in 1952, there are Paramount, MGM, Warner Pathé, Gaumont, and Fox producing 115 newsreels for 70 countries. Canada doesn't even have its own newsreel production. Right? The control over the image that's circulating within the colonized space itself, right, is here. Egypt has its own industry. India has an industry. There are ways in which places that have their own industry can respond and produce images, but there are very few places on the planet that have that at that point. And that's why what's interesting is that in 1956, so after Bandung, Tito invites Nasser and Nehru to meet in Yugoslavia, and they present the plan for the non-aligned movement. And immediately after that, Nasser goes back and nationalizes the Suez Canal. And this becomes a huge moment of the end of the colonial enterprise of the French and British. Right? The U.S. forces the French and the British to back off from the Suez Canal and reopen global trade, and in effect says not on our watch anymore. So your colonial project is over in this exercise of military force. But if you look at the footage, right, it's to the advantage. It all looks like a valiant war effort, and those people did this stuff. If you look at the Egyptian footage, it looks very different, and that's what intrigues me. And again, it's at this moment that Tito then sends his camera people out and starts this kind of training project to create the image that you're asking for. Right? So it doesn't actually emerge until at this point where resources and what we would describe as the beginning of an alternative media structure appear. And that becomes very important. The second part of the question,
well, it's a whole new continent, kind of criticism, kind of development from, kind of the global south.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting then about the non-aligned movement is that by 1964, the United Nations has expanded dramatically. The membership and indeed countries like India are demanding the rapid admission to membership of the UN, because the understanding is that the General Assembly will be the source of adjudicating a new kind of economic relationship with the former colonizers. And there's, in that context, the assertion of a new economic plan. And some of it is interesting because it parallels some of the Marshall Plan, but with the understanding that the Global South will draw its own resources together and distribute them to support each other. And Tito has an understanding that he can work with Haile Selassie, the emperor, because each country within its own autonomous narrative will arrive eventually at a socialist proposition. So that's okay for him. But the point being that there is an attempt to create something that would have been a counter to the World Bank. The Cold War, so both East and West invest massively in regaining control over this space. By the 1970s, the image looks very different. Right? The image is now one of civil war, of corruption, of the devastation of war, embedded in the language that the 1970s television set, Vietnam, etc., is presenting to us as they are a problem amongst themselves. Right? But it's really largely about the pulling apart of this non-aligned movement in its attempt to create a kind of economic, a new economic, it's referred to as a new economic model at the time.
I have a brief question that's about...
I have a long answer, I'm sure.
It's a brief question about, there's a few companies who produce those reels, and then they're exported to different markets. They're standardized in the type of tropes they exploit and that they portray. But is the commentary the same? Because
no.
the commentary, okay, because even like a French, if it's going to, the reel is going to be shown in Belgium and France or in Montreal, that could be a different commentary.
No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And what's interesting about it in terms of the Cold War is that the last real moment of East-West collaboration is at the Nuremberg war trials, where there's footage being filmed by the Americans, but it's there's 6 points in which cameras are recording at angles, and the footage is released to the Allies for their own editing purposes. And one of the actually projects, and I have a little film that I need to work on the text a little bit better to match up with the images. The images get further than my voice is going, and so it's a mess. But I actually chart out the difference in the editing between the similarities and the differences between the Soviet, the American, the French, and the British.
But that's still the images. It's not.
It's the same images. It's
okay,
just
completely the same. Okay.
But for instance, the march of the judges into the chamber at the opening ceremony in the Soviet judge comes in first, right? In the American, the American judge comes in first.
Yeah, but you see, that's images. It's not the text. It's not the commentary.
And the voice and the comment is
American or
exactly. So I'm going to make this a long answer though, because one of the things that intrigues me precisely, and I have a Polish presence here, because it's intriguing about this project that the first newsreel footage actually begins in 1944 in France with the liberation of Paris. And at that moment, the Germans are still present in France. The front has just moved, and the Free French take control over their space by starting to produce newsreels. The newsreel that we see in October here is already the Free French having turned it over into a private enterprise project. The second is Poland, right?
Warsaw, right?
No, Łódź.
The Łódź get no.
No. It's because that's where the front is, and it's a stable place. And the Polish newsreel is produced by people who had been in exile in the Soviet Union, who had trained with Vertov. And their first item is of the landing of a Free French general in Łódź. So you have this plane that has flown over German airspace. There is no presence of the Soviets. There's no presence of the Russians in this. Right? But immediately, these two things constitute, in my analysis, this beginning of a similarity and an interconnection of the European space. And it's really quite remarkable to me, and in a condition of scarcity and resources, that on the other side, precisely in very similar conditions. And then the next thing is the quest for justice and the quest for the reconstitution of the demolished spaces. And in the Polish newsreel, there's a farmer who has protected paintings by hiding them in the stall under the cows, and they bring them up and they reveal now these paintings of Polish cultural heritage. And that's something that becomes parallel in all of the spaces, but it's this first thing. And I'm at this moment it is not planned, but it bespeaks a certain kind of material reality of what it means to be driving out the occupying force.
Are we at time?
I think we have like 2 minutes. You have one.
I'll ask a very quick last question.
I'm going to answer very long.
The first clip that you showed was the French newsreel, and then the second one that you might have shown was the Dutch newsreel, correct?
Yeah.
Which, if I heard you correctly before you started giving the talk today, does contain some anti-Dutch sentiment.
So it's interesting, yeah.
So I was really curious if there are moments like this where these newsreels kind of can't, like, the standardized image can't exactly be contained.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I love that item, because you arrive in Batavia, and the first thing you see, and this is the thing that's also interesting about it, you see a city with streetcars that looks like it could be Rotterdam, well, actually not Rotterdam because that's been bombed, but it could be Amsterdam, right? So it's a modern city, and that's very different than the way that we saw in the Italian footage, that like it's very primitive. I have actually some images of Mogadishu at that point in time, and it's a beautiful city, right? But you go out into the countryside, you go out in order to find the primitive, right? If you go, as I was saying, if you go out into southern Italy, if you go out into Bavaria, you're going to find the primitive, right? But here it's constituted in a particular way. It's hard to get to, you have to go all that way. So, so the Dutch are actually concerned because they have not been in the colonies. The Japanese interned them, right? They haven't been in the colonies for a very long time, ultimately. The British are in charge of Indonesia at this point in time, have driven the Japanese out. The Dutch are actually coming out of internment camps, and so that there's a hotel where the Dutch is there, and this event is actually showing the moment in which the governor returns to Batavia. Right? So it's a kind of late process, and in this street scene, you see on the streetcars slogans in Indonesian, Yogyakartan, and then you see also English, where it says things on them like we would better go to hell than to the colonies. And it also the voiceover says, and look, there are Sukarno flags, nationalist flags here, and it basically is a representation of, in order to regain control here, we have a lot of work to do. Right? And that what intrigues me about it is it actually represents an almost too much. Right? It's too much, and the other newsreel footage, the Dutch have a real scarcity, a paucity of newsreel at that point in time. The other newsreel from that period is things like how to deal with the black market, how to deal with redistribution of certain resources, and then suddenly the colonies. And that's what makes it stand out in a particularly interesting way. Again, a long answer, sorry. Last one.
Yeah, I think they should be asked. So hearing the story about
Maybe
Namibia.
short answer.
I will do my best to be short.
So hearing the story of Namibia, and fast forward, there was a recent interview that went out between the German ambassador in Namibia with the president. Then it was live. So
The Namibian president.
yeah,
Dead. Mhm.
yeah, it was live.